thank you to TCFE for helping us figure out what the DV bonus looks like for the balance of state. You know, this is something that we've been working with the Mollies together on now for the last couple of years, and are really excited to hear from victim service providers about your experience and how we might further collaborate. So I'm going to move us into the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to a staff person to get us going. And I apologize, we were having trouble uploading the PowerPoint, so we're just going to be working in a PDF version of the PowerPoint today. But you can also download these materials today on the Today's Materials pod, which is directly underneath the chat feature of the presentation. It's titled DV Bonus Funds. And with that, I will turn it over to Hope.
Thanks, Jim. I just want to echo what you had already stated, which is thanks so much for joining us today to learn more about DV bonus funds that may potentially be available through the FY2022 Continuum of Care Program competition. My name is Hope Rogers. I am the COC Performance Manager with Texas Homeless Network, joined today by Jim Ward. And through this presentation, we hope that participants will learn a basic understanding of the COC, as well as a basic understanding of Texas Homeless Network, or THN's, role in the COC, the types of applications that we'll be seeking, next steps in the process, some grant must-knows or requirements, and then we'll move into an open Q&A session. So we have a number of staff at THN who support or contribute to this process annually, but the primary folks are included here on screen, including myself, Jim Ward, and Axton Nichols. If you end up submitting an intent to apply or application through this process, you'll be getting to know us pretty well here in the next couple of months.
So just kind of dive right in, talking about what is a COC, because I recognize that's a little bit different from the structure that victim service providers might be used to. A COC is a concept defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It can reference a number of different things. What we'll talk about today is a program operated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, but it can also reference a community-based network of planning bodies, service providers, stakeholders, people with lived expertise, survivors of domestic violence, VSPs. It's really a loose term for that network of organizations that are working together to address homelessness, whatever that looks like for a given community. There's also, when you start thinking about like the COC as a concept, it can also reference the geographic area covered by that community-based planning network. And so we'll kind of walk through that here in just a second. We're going to buzz through these slides pretty quick, because the hope here is that we're going to talk with y'all, or at least get some feedback from the participants on today's call about you know, how familiar are you with this process? And so we really want to kind of get through this stuff as quickly as we can. So I'm going to take us on to the next slide and talk a little bit. Actually, I'm going to turn that over to Hope to talk about the purpose of the COC program.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I want to just quickly touch on the purpose of the COC program, which is designed to promote a community-wide commitment to the goal of ending homelessness. In the way in which HUD seeks to achieve this goal is through providing funding to nonprofits, state and local governments to quickly rehouse individuals and families experiencing homelessness in a way that minimizes trauma while promoting self-sufficiency and stability. So THN serves as the lead agency to the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care, or everything in orange in this picture. The Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care is one of 11 COCs in the state of Texas, and the largest in the state of Texas as well. To be eligible to apply for COC funding through the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care, your project must serve a community that is covered in orange. And a larger version of this map can be found on our website if you're curious if you fall into our service area.
So a question that we get quite frequently is, what is THN's role to the continuum of care? So we are officially designated in the eyes of HUD as the collaborative applicant for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and what we're required to do as the collaborative applicant. But know that we're also the HMIS, or Homeless Management Information System lead agency for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. For victim service providers, obviously, y'all using what HUD would call a comparable database. Most often, we find that that is Osnium, at least from TCFB. That's the most common comparable database that exists in our service area. And like Hope mentioned, the COC is massive, right? You saw the map on the previous slide. We cover 215 of Texas's 254 counties. That's approximately 85% of the state's landmass. And I mentioned that we're designated as a collaborative applicant, so we're required to carry out certain activities and as the collaborative applicant. So those are listed in bullet point form below, but they are conducting the annual point in time count. So you may have heard of this. It's a point in time census, if you will, of everyone experiencing homelessness on a given night in January. We do that typically annually. I will say that the pandemic created some issues for us over the last couple of years. 2023, we're anticipating to get back into the full swing of the point in time count. And that's administered by THN, but really we couldn't do it without the support and really the boots on the ground in the communities through local homeless coalitions. But in addition to the point in time count, we administer the HMIS system for the balance of state. I mentioned that a moment ago. There are several hundred users and several hundred organizations in the balance of state participating in that HMIS system. And so as part of the administering an HMIS system is reporting to HUD about how the system is performing. And so we evaluate and monitor the performance of COC program funded recipients in our service area. And then again, what's most relevant to y'all today is hosting an annual competitive application process for the allocation of COC program funds in our service area. So that would include the potential for any set aside funding for special populations like the DV bonus. If you've been paying attention to the COC program, you know that they just announced another massive initiative called the Supplemental NOFO, which is targeted to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in rural communities. There's a lot of opportunities to participate with HUD right now, but that's just kind of a snippet of the things that we do. We work together pretty closely with all of the field offices, or the HUD field offices in the state of Texas. There's three, one in San Antonio, one in Houston, and then one in Fort Worth, to help shepherd folks through this complex process of administering COC program funds. So the annual competition, so how someone would access DV bonus funds, right? In order for an organization to access DV bonus funds, they would have to participate in this annual competitive application process. So that is hosted by THN. So we solicit applications from partners all around our service area, evaluate those, and then submit them on behalf of the applicants to HUD for evaluation and award. Not everyone that we would recommend to HUD will get an award. Unfortunately, the COC program nationally is a very competitive pool of funding, but I'm happy to report over the last several years, we have almost doubled the size of our Continuum of Care funding through the Continuum of Care program, which is again a small fraction of the work that goes into the work happening in our communities, but is relevant nonetheless. So eligible entities for the Continuum of Care program, and by extension the DV bonus funds, would be nonprofits, city, local, and state governmental agencies, and public housing authorities. So if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, public or private, you are eligible to apply for Continuum of Care funding. Most often, it will fund the Continuum of Care program, or annual competition will fund renewal grants, and often at least over the last 3 to 4 years, HUD has made available new funding for new projects through what they call bonus funding. So the DV bonus specifically is a relatively new type of bonus opportunity. It is intended to meet and exclusively intended to meet the needs of survivors experiencing housing instability. So a survivor that meets one of the HUD definitions of literal homelessness, either through Category 1 or 4 of the HUD homeless definition. The key thing there is that the funds are dedicated to survivors. So whether a survivor qualifies under Category 1 or Category 4 is really kind of irrelevant. The primary eligibility criteria there is that they are a survivor of domestic violence. So in the past, and this is the thing that we were talking about with TCFV that kind of prompted this webinar today, is very few actual, and I'm going to use the air quotes there, actual VSPs have applied to administer DV bonus funds. And so we are hoping and seeking feedback to learn maybe why that is and what we could do to make this opportunity more attractive to victim service providers. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about like what a VSP is in the eyes of folks that would identify as a victim service provider here in just a few minutes. The only other thing that I wanted to reference is that, again, in 2022, HUD released a supplemental NOFO, not the subject of the following slides, because we're going to talk a little bit about the process for the DV bonus funds. But just know that that complicated things on a factor of probably 4 or 5 from what they normally are. And so if you're, interested in the supplemental NOFO, there's another webinar on the 13th that will hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have. And so I'll move us along into the types of applications that can be funded under the DV bonus.
Yeah, so the types of applications that we'll be seeking through the DV bonus include rapid rehousing and joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, which I'm sure most folks are vaguely familiar with. But if you're not, rapid rehousing provides short to medium term housing subsidy and wraparound supportive services to individuals and families experiencing literal homelessness, including folks who are fleeing a domestic violence situation, where short to medium term is defined as 3 to 24 months. And supportive services can include holistic case management as well as financial assistance available for a range of supportive services, including but not limited to things like child care assistance, food assistance, transportation, employment-related needs, and legal services. The second is joint TH and rapid rehousing, which combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing into a single project type, where participants can benefit from one or both components, but must have access to both project components at any time. So in addition to this, recipients must document the client choice regarding access and must combine this with supportive services that's available through both transitional and rapid rehousing, including the holistic case management and supportive services I outlined in rapid rehousing. So I want to provide, moving on from the types of applications, I want to provide a super high level overview of the competitive process, which Jim touched on briefly and is outlined here. So the first being that THN staff drafts an RFP or request for proposals, as well as the application itself and evaluation criteria, which is approved by the COC board. This information is sourced directly from the annual COC NOFO or Notice of Funding Opportunity, which HUD has not yet released for FY2022. Second, THN staff makes all application materials available and solicits applications, as well as deliver any relevant trainings and provides technical assistance to applicants, particularly new applicants. And all this information is communicated both on our website and through our competition listserv. Third, applications are reviewed and scored through a third-party evaluation process called the Independent Review Team. And then from there, THN staff ranks projects in order of priority and generates the project priority listing. And lastly, THN staff combines all of this information and packages up into the consolidated application, and where we apply for funding on behalf of the COC for all projects. So moving into more of the application itself, the application first begins with an intent to apply. So any interested parties must submit their interest through the intent to apply. This takes place in a platform called SurveyMonkey Apply, also known as Mementos. Again, this link will be posted on our website and also sent out through our competition listserv. So if you are not signed up for our listserv, I would be sure to sign up for that today. We can drop that link in the chat a bit later in this presentation. But the purpose of the intent to apply is simply to gauge interest and identify the scope of applications we expect to receive, and gather basic information about who is applying and what they're applying for. But with that being said, projects will not be held to the information listed in their intent to apply. So following the intent to apply, folks will move into the full application if they are eligible. And the full application includes a range of things from a supplemental project narrative, where folks will provide a more in-depth look about the project that they're seeking to fund. Additionally, and things like proposed budget, proposed activities, project type, things of that nature. We also collect letters of support, which could be from your local homeless coalition or community partners in your area if you don't have a local homeless coalition in your area. Additionally, applicants will create an applicant profile and complete a project application through a website called eSnaps, which is the electronic Csc Program application and grants management system utilized by HUD to support the Csc Program funding application and awards process. So applicants will export that information and upload it into SurveyMonkey for THN staff to review. The application also collects documentation about monitorings, as well as collects a certificate of consistency. So for the monitoring history report, applicants will answer a series of questions surrounding relevant audits or monitorings for federal or state awards that they've received in the past 3 years, and then we'll be asked to submit any relevant documentation surrounding that as well. In addition, the certificate of consistency, this is a HUD-generated form that requires local jurisdictions to certify that the proposed activities included in the COC project application are consistent with the jurisdiction's currently approved consolidated plan.
So as Hope and I were kind of thinking about what are some of the things that folks would absolutely need to know before deciding to apply for Continuum of Care Program funds, they're bulleted here below, but applicants must be registered with the System for Award Management, that's sam.gov. If you're already administering federal programming, whether that's through the state pass-through as a pass-through agency or through some other funding, you're likely already registered for the System for Award Management, but that is a requirement, and the System for Award Management registration must be active at the time the application closes. That's a really important one. It's always an unfortunate obligation for us to reject applications that don't meet this threshold requirement. Something else that's really important for applicants to know is that there is a 25% matching requirement. So that match can be either cash or in kind, and we could probably spend this entire webinar staffing specific instances of potential match and determining whether it would or would not be eligible to be used for match. The key thing to understand about the matching requirement is that you have to match eligible activities under the Continuum of Care program. So not necessarily the activities that you were funded for. So a quick example would be if you're funded for rapid rehousing and case management, but you also operate a child care center, you could use the value of the child care provided to participants in the DV bonus or COC program funded project as a match toward that 25% matching requirement. So some of the more creative matching commitments that I've heard of are rental assistance matches, legal assistance, child care, any eligible activity under the Continuum of Care program could be used as a match, provided that there are no limitations on the use of those activities in the same project type. So definitely something to think about and think about early. That 25% matching requirement adds up pretty quickly, as I'm sure some of our current recipients on this call can attest to. And that 25% matching requirement applies to the entirety of the project application. So if you applied for a $200,000 grant, you will need $50,000 in matching funds, either cash or in kind. Recipients must have an accounting system compliant with 2 CFR 200 and internal controls. You must have financial policies and procedures and a way to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. The accounting system compliant with 2 CFR 200 is a more in-depth conversation. I would definitely recommend coordinating with your CFO or other financial professional to determine whether or not your accounting system is in fact compliant with 2 CFR 200. Obviously, we've been talking about, grants are awarded competitively. And so there's no guarantee from year to year that a project will be funded. However, renewal projects are generally funded to the tune of about 95 to 96% annually. And something else that's kind of important, it's a little different. HUD allows up to 18-month initial grant terms. So if someone were to be awarded in FY2022, and they started in January of 2024, that grant could go through August of 2020, or through July, June of 2026. But then following that, it would renew on a 12-month basis. And then the recipients themselves, even though THN has this relationship to the application process, the recipients contract directly with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So we don't get in the middle of the contracting process. We do, however, play a supporting role over the life of the project. So HUD will often come to the COC lead or the collaborative applicant and ask for the collaborative applicant to perform technical assistance with the recipients receiving these program funds in their community, or monitor those recipients through file audits and just general technical assistance to promote efficacy and outcomes for participants. We already talked about applicants must apply for renewal on an annual basis. And then we've already talked about the fact that DV bonus projects must serve survivors exclusively. And then a really important one that I think is we haven't talked about yet is the fact that all projects must be administered in fidelity to housing first, right? You cannot place arbitrary conditions on participation. Housing is the primary intervention, and those holistic wraparound supports must be offered. It is at the participant's choice whether or not they engage, but the way I like to put it is supportive services are voluntary for the participant, but they're not voluntary for the provider. So we would expect that folks awarded under the COC program are exploring all options to keep people housed, to get people housed and to keep people housed. And so what applicants can do right now, check your SAM registration, update that SAM registration if necessary. They've changed the process a little bit. So if it's expired, it takes about 6 weeks to get reactivated. So I would highly recommend, if you're considering applying under any of the opportunities through THN this summer, to check your SAM registration and make sure that it's up to date. You can start and update your applicant profile and eSnaps, start collecting letters of support, sign up for competition updates, which is linked in the chat pod here today. And then to learn more about the COC program, the HUD Exchange actually over the last few years has put out a ton of really good content around self-paced technical assistance for the COC program. So we also on our website have resources, but the HUD virtual binders are like the final word, if you will, with technical assistance for the Continuum of Care program. And then finally, if you know that you are not going to apply, we would love for you to consider to participate in the independent review team. The application for the independent review team is open now. I can find that and put it in the chat for you. The independent review team is limited to folks that are not applying for COC program funds. So staff of applicant agencies are not eligible to apply and participate in the independent review team because of the apparent conflict of interest. But otherwise, I think who better to assess the efficacy of a project intending to serve people fleeing domestic violence than a victim service provider themselves. And so that's kind of like the 30,000 foot view of the program. And really we had hoped to structure the rest of this this time together as kind of open Q&A, open feedback. We do have a couple of poll questions, and I can tell you like the existential question that I've been wrestling with. And I'm sure TCFE will have some feedback for me, but I'm really interested in provider feedback about this process. And so I'm going to stop there. I think we do have some poll questions queued up, and I figured why just let's just jump into the heavy stuff first. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we're struggling with is how do we get folks whose primary mission it is to serve people fleeing domestic violence to administer these program funds. And so I'm not sure, Hope or Craig, if you could pull up that chat, or excuse me, that poll question related to the DV bonus funds, and how should we determine what a victim service provider is? Can someone pull that one up for me? And then while that's happening, I see Jenny's question in the chat. Do we know how much the DV bonus will be? Jenny, if they use the same formula that they used last year, we'll cap out at $5 million. So I'm anticipating about $5 million in DV bonus funding this year. Now that said, they have not released the NOFO, and so that could change the year before 2021's, which was 2019, because we took a pause in the height of the pandemic. In 2019, there was about $3.5 million available in DV bonus. So I don't anticipate that it will go down significantly from 3.5. I'm hoping for 5 million, but it could be anywhere in there, but we're talking millions of dollars. And I'm going to go ahead and open the first poll, which is what sorts of things should THN consider when determining applicant eligibility for DV bonus funds? And there is no right or wrong answer. And if you don't see the answer that you think is most important, please, you can type that out. The next one is other considerations. I'm going to open that poll right now, and you can just type out other things that we should consider when trying to determine how we get folks to the table. And the idea is that we would limit eligibility to folks that we are asking to apply, essentially. So that would be the idea is that would promote participation from folks whose primary mission it is, again, to serve survivors. I don't know if the Mollies have anything that they would add to that or challenge me on that as an idea. But I feel like I've said it probably 5 times. I'm really interested in getting some new folks to the table that were doing this work before this funding came out. And then something else that's not on the screen, but is there anything that you would recommend that we do not consider as like, is there anything that we should exclude from eligibility? So I'm seeing some stuff. Jim just said it, doing the work before the announcement came out. Okay. Existing active collaboration with local homeless coalitions, long history of serving survivors. There is a new poll question that we just kind of came up with on the fly, which is, should we exclude anything from eligibility, and what would that be? I'd like to screen people in rather than screening people out, but I hope folks understand what I'm trying to get at here, which is, how do we get the right folks to apply? So I'm looking at the poll question, what should THN consider? So the use of a comparable database is it's got a few responses. I'm going to broadcast these results if everyone's okay with that, just because I think it's really interesting. So folks should be able to see their responses there. So overall, things are pretty strongly connected. Everything as far as the use of a comparable database, evaluating the organization's mission statement, TCFE network affiliation, HHSC designation as a family violence program, and not that any one of these things, if you were not, for example, an HHSC family violence program, would you be excluded from participating? I think the idea is that we're trying to, again, attract the folks that we really think are best suited to administer these funds. Let me see, I'm going to move this down a little bit. Yeah, so I'm looking at the other considerations. In the past, there was just one agency able to apply, if possible, to open to more than one. And I'd like to learn more about that, what your experience was. But the one thing that I cannot do anything about, unfortunately, is the matching funding. Unfortunately, that is a statutory requirement. COCs have voiced our concerns to HUD in Washington, D.C. over the years, probably more than a dozen times, about the significance of the match and the limitation that puts on bringing new people to the table. But as it stands right now, matching that 25% match will be a requirement of the annual competition. I have no reason to believe that it won't be, but again, the NOFO has not been released yet, so they could surprise us and say, hey, surprise, this year there's no match. But it doesn't remove the statutory requirement that match exists. And so when an agency, if they were to remove the matching requirement from this year's competition, when they go back for renewal in a following year, that matching requirement would likely exist. Now, what we can do, I think, is provide technical assistance to interested applicants to talk about what they might be able to use as match. Oh, I see what you're saying. It would be best to split the matching amongst all the agencies that are applying. That's an interesting idea. So Kelly's asking in the chat, do you have a timeline on the intent to apply and the full application? So unfortunately, I do not have a firm timeline on the intent to apply or full application. However, I do believe that HUD is hoping to close the entire process by the end of their fiscal year, which is September 30th. And so working back from that as a timeline would mean that we're more than likely going to be opening the intent to apply in late July or early August. With the application closing sometime mid to late August. And Cynthia is interested in the independent review team. Oh, that's awesome. I will find that link and get it over in the chat here in just a moment, certainly before we hop off the call today.
Jim, I'm pulling it now, so don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you. So I see some folks typing in the chat. I guess the other thing that I'm interested in is the experience of folks that have applied in the past, or, Lauren put in the chat earlier, the comparable database and the reporting requirements or something that have prohibited them just from a cost basis from participating in the past. Has that been the experience of other potential applicants? And so Daisy asked, while folks are chewing on that one, Daisy asked, how many DV bonus projects does THN submit under the application? That's a great question. So in 2021, we submitted 3 projects under the DV bonus designation, and all 3 were funded. And now there is no limitation to the number of projects that a COC can submit up to the maximum available to that COC. So for example, if our maximum was 5 million and we had $6 million in applications, they're only going to fund up to 5 million. And there is no guarantee that all $5 million of application funding would be awarded. And so Sissy asks, can someone please elaborate that has received the grant, the processing and the process and the matching? And then Ginny says the match is a challenge, but we use other funding sources, including ESG. And so ESG is the Emergency Solutions Grant, which is another federal housing intervention. Typically, it's a formula grant, so it's administered a little bit differently. It's administered through the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and then through local jurisdictions. So local jurisdictions have to meet a certain threshold before they're invited to administer ESG, and that's typically like a population threshold. And there's only 7 ESG city county recipients in our service area. That 215 county area, there's 7. So almost everyone that's administering ESG in the balance of state is doing so through TDHCA. So Ginny asked, is the DV bonus only used for THRRH or transitional housing and rapid rehousing? We need more supportive housing. We need more permanent supportive housing. And the short answer to that is eligibility to the DV bonus to be funded using this particular set aside is limited to rapid rehousing and the joint component project. However, there may be COC bonus funds that could be used for supportive housing, and similarly through the unsheltered NOFO, you can use unsheltered set aside funds or rural set aside funds for that matter for supportive housing program or for permanent supportive housing. So short answer is the DV bonus may not be right for that particular need, but there is a plethora of opportunity to try to fund permanent supportive housing right now. It just wouldn't be with the same kind of restrictions as the DV bonus funding. Does that make sense, Jenny? So I'm liking this idea of collaborative projects between organizations focused on homelessness. I'm looking at the other considerations now in the poll pod. So collaborative projects between organizations focused on homelessness and organizations focused on victim services. This could be the workaround for agencies not using a comparable database like we used to do with the ESG program. So my take on that would be you could absolutely apply as a type of collaborative partnership. The structure that would have to exist in that application would be one of recipient. So one agency would have to be designated as the recipient of those funds, and they would have a contract with HUD. The other agency or agencies would be subrecipients of those funds, and the agency that was designated as a recipient, once you start passing federal funds through your organization as a recipient, you are on the hook for certain pass-through activities, such as monitoring the subrecipients that you're providing funding to. So it's definitely not impossible. We have organizations and recipients right now in our COC where, for example, the city is the recipient, and the city, the local government will subcontract out that award to local nonprofits to administer the direct client assistance. And the city reports to HUD, does the application, does all the administrative work mainly, and the subrecipients are, again, providing the direct client assistance. So I don't know that it would necessarily get to a workaround for agencies not using a comparable database, because at the end of the day, and I see the chat from Kelly, can you please provide more information on the use of a comparable database? So I'm gonna, and as the comparable database administrator, or given TCFV's relationship to the comparable database, Osnium, I would defer to y'all for anything that I miss. But HUD is really looking for recipients of federal funding to be able to report on the use of those funds. So victim service providers victim service providers are statutorily prohibited from participating in the homeless management information system. And so the need for a comparable database arose out of those privacy protections that HMIS cannot accommodate. And so a comparable database essentially serves all the functions of an HMIS system, except for the sharing part, as far as I understand. And then I see Craig just put a comparable database manual in the chat, which may or may not be super helpful. But the blurb above that is, right, like they have to comply with HMIS requirements. So, for example, they have to be able to record exits. They have to be able to record entries. They have to be able to record income growth. They have to be able to record all of the things that an HMIS system must do, and allow them to collect that client level data and report based on that. So I know Lauren had mentioned the CAPER. The CAPER is not a requirement of the Continuum of Care program. The reports that are due from a Continuum of Care grant are your annual performance report. So that's basically like a progress report for your project, due 90 days after the end of the grant close date. And it looks at things like I just mentioned, right? Like how many people did you serve over the course of the year? What percentage of those folks had income growth? What percentage of them exited to stable housing? Where did people come from? That sort of information. Again, I don't know all of the comparable databases that exist in the state of Texas, and someone else on this call might, but it's possible that there are databases that you're using right now that would satisfy the requirement. The one that I'm most familiar with, again, that does satisfy the requirement is Osnium. I feel like I maybe just confused that more than it needed to be, but. Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. So Jerry asked, can we elaborate on the services that we would need to offer? Yeah, so as I mentioned, right, this Continuum of Care program and the DV bonus funding is first and foremost a housing intervention, right? It's designed to meet someone fleeing domestic violence and quickly and while minimizing further trauma, get them into a stable housing situation. Then the work comes of keeping someone in housing, right? And so what we're looking for with services being offered by the recipient would be at minimum through the recipient or a subrecipient, that holistic case management, right? So participants in the Continuum of Care program are expected to have an assessment of service need completed annually. That assessment of service need really looks at like, okay, you need childcare to get to work. Let's figure out a plan for childcare so you can get to your job. Or you haven't been working at all because your abuser has been controlling all of your finances. Let's work on getting you into the workforce through education and job force training. So those are the types of activities that are eligible under the Continuum of Care program. The one that we see as kind of critical to all of those other services is someone to coordinate that. So that holistic case management that can be funded under the program. And then, if you have partnerships in your community for job force training or for childcare, you can leverage those partnerships. Again, you might be able to use some of those things as match for the program. But at minimum and at its core, we're looking for that holistic case management. Does that help, Jerry? Yeah. Does the joint TH and RRH allow for construction or rehabilitation for transitional housing? That's a great question, Daisy. In 2021, it did not. In 2022, I don't anticipate that it will either, although construction, rehabilitation, and acquisition is theoretically an eligible activity. HUD often places limitations on the types of eligible activities that they'll fund in any given program year. I'm not anticipating that it will be an eligible cost for 2022, but it could be. Great question, Joe. What else? What other questions do folks have? And Ginny, I hate to put you on the spot, but is there anything that you would share about your experience in the Continuum of Care program? And I'm sorry, y'all. We're just the last thing, and we're moving to Zoom on 8/1, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to move to Zoom because I feel like this is not the best medium for interactive conversation. Yeah. So Sissy asks, if we need assistance while filling out the application, who do we contact? We'll put the email address in the chat here, but it's txboscoc@thn.org. Thank you, Hope. And so we're available to answer technical questions. This is absolutely a technical process. There is unfortunately no way around that part of it. But we don't want to make it any harder than it needs to be. And so if you have questions for staff, you can reach out to that email address, and either myself, Hope, or Axton will reply. The strongest recommendation I could make would be to sign up for competition updates, because that's missing a deadline in this process would be, potentially catastrophic for an applicant. Jenny said it's been a learning experience for sure. The first year we didn't know what our performance measures would be. We learned it by doing the first APR. Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is that applicants to some extent do have the ability to set their own performance metrics. For example, HUD expects like a minimum of 80% of the folks served by a permanent supportive housing project, even though I know that's not an eligible activity under the DV bonus. They expect 80% of those folks to move on to stable and secure housing at program exit. But the applicant can say in their project narratives that, we know we're going to get to 90%. And so we'll set a goal for ourselves of 90%. I'm not going to go in depth into like the application process because that's a whole other webinar. But there are a ton of written resources every year to help folks submit quality applications, even if you've never done it before, through the use of things like the detailed instructions. So Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, Jenny. I know a lot of folks are in that boat, VSPs or not. It is a learning process, and it is been a learning process for us at THN as well.
Jim, did you want to see those other poll questions yet?
Yeah, go ahead. You can pull other poll questions up. And Hope sent me a text that her internet is going in and out, so I'm not sure if Hope's with us here or not. This one's kind of a little late since we've already kind of been talking in the chat. But if you have specific questions about the content that we've gone over today that you want us to follow up on, please use the short answer text box above to let us know a little bit more about what those questions are. If you want us to reach out and schedule a call, we'd be happy to do that. But we don't want to spam y'all with content if it's not welcome. So, and then we kind of already talked about this as well. And I would imagine that if we had folks like Lauren shared in the chat, if you've considered applying, and what is it specifically that's prevented you from applying? Interesting. Okay. So maybe it's I'm looking at the what's prevented you from applying responses so far, and both of them are that I see here anyway are we didn't know about it, so that's great. I'm happy to hear that we're reaching the folks that we were hoping to reach. Oh, so there's someone else replied in what's prevented you. In the past, it has been a fear of not proposing a competitive project, thinking that only one DV bonus project was selected. We thought it was just too competitive and we could not compete with larger programs. This is great feedback, y'all. Yeah, so and I'm trying to remember back to 2018, and it may have been that way in the first year. I don't recall for sure, but it's definitely not that way, or it wasn't that way in 2021. And I'm not anticipating that they'll limit the number of THRRH or rapid rehousing projects that can be applied for. The only limitation would be the amount of funding that's available and how well that project and the COC perform in the application process. Something I neglected to mention that I would normally kind of go over in a more like in-depth COC program competition webinar are how HUD scores your project application. So there's three parts to the continuum of care project application. There's the project applications themselves from people hoping to administer direct client assistance. There's what HUD calls the priority listing, which is our assessment and recommendations about those project applications in their ranked order. So the first application on the priority listing would be the one that we would recommend for funding first, and then going down the line in that order. The third thing that we're required to submit is what HUD calls the COC application. So that asks questions about that 215 county area and how we're responding to different HUD policy priorities. So sometimes that's things like, what are we doing around workforce development, or This year, I'm sure there's going to be stuff around unsheltered homelessness. It changes from year to year based on the administration and based on the department's policy priorities for that year. And so the COC application is something that THN completes on behalf of that 215 county area, but it's relevant to the project applications because it's when HUD goes in to evaluate which projects they're going to fund, 50% of a given project score is coming from that COC application. So let's say, for example, there's 50 points possible for the COC application and 50 points possible for your project application for a total of 100 points. If the COC comes in and really knocks it out of the park and we score 45 out of 50 points, every project application that we submit is going to have a leg up in relation to project applications from other COCs. So even a project that didn't maybe submit as competitive of a project application, provided it meets all the threshold and threshold criteria, if it were recommended to HUD in a situation where the COC performed really well, then it's got a greater likelihood of being funded. If the COC performs not as well, like let's just say we scored 25 points out of 50, that's going to make it a lot harder for even the highest performing project or highest scoring project in our COC to be competitive against the highest scoring project from another COC where they had scored 40 or 50, 45 points. So I'm happy to report that our COC continuously does pretty well. We're not the highest scoring COC, and we're definitely not the lowest scoring COC. We typically rank. They don't give us like quartiles or anything like that, but it's definitely above average and above the median. And as I mentioned before, all three of the DV bonus project applications that were submitted in 2021 were funded. So I think that speaks both to the competitiveness of the COC and the competitiveness of the applications that we submit. So it is a really complicated process. We hope to make it as easy on y'all as we can. I think the main thing is putting ourselves out there and trying to access the funds. Because one thing is for certain, if we don't apply, they're not going to come knocking on our door and give it to us. That's for sure. But really wanting to support survivors and organizations that have been out there doing this work and continue, and we'll do it whether or not we get these funds or not. So I thank you, Csc. So when I say project, I'm referencing like a project application. So project is not, you don't think of it in terms of like the projects. I'm talking about it in terms of a specific set of funded activities that were applied for in a single grant application. Yep. Thank you. I recognize I also use a lot of slang or jargon that is just not helpful sometimes. Well, we're approaching the top of the hour. We have our the BOS COC email in the chat. We'll anchor it again here to the bottom of the chat. Give folks a couple of minutes to copy that and to download the material. And then I don't know if there's anything else that that folks feel like they need to share with us, but you're welcome to use that email address. And as I mentioned, Hope, Axon, or I will respond as quickly as possible. I see Molly writing, and again, I just want to thank TCFE for giving us this opportunity to speak with you all today. We're so grateful for the work that you do for survivors day in and day out. We really cannot do the work of ending homelessness without you all. Oh, and I guess in a recording, so we have been recording. I guess we should have talked about that at the top of the hour. This session was being recorded, so we will make it available to TCFV, and it'll go up on our website as well for folks that weren't able to make it today. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your feedback.
Thanks, y'all.